Hi guys, it's Miss Christine. Here's a story, Noises and Mr. Flibberty Jib. Mr. Flibberty Jib had a most unusual rumble in his head. It went rumble, rumble, rumble. Then it went bumble, bumble, bumble. Now Mr. Flibberty Jib didn't mean to, but she made Mr. Flibberty Jib's tumble and bumble worse than ever. You see, Mrs. Flibberty Jib cooks the finest roast beef in town. But no one could cook roast beef without closing the other door, kershut, and covering the roasting pans, kerbang. Besides, Mrs. Flibberty Jib knits mittens all day long. No one can knit even one mitten unless the needles say click, click, clickety-clack. Click and knit, knit and click. Mrs. Flibberty Jib says that Mr. Flibberty Jib has a rumble in his head because he eats too little roast beef and doesn't wear his mittens. He says he has large rumble in his head because the house and town are full of noises. She says nonsense. Then the old clock strikes. Bong, bong, bong. 3 o'clock, Mr. Flibberty Jib. The telephone shouts, bring, bring. Answer me, quick, answer me. The grocery boy at the back door says, tap, 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 answer me. Then the telephone rings again. Too much noise, says Mr. Flibberty Jib. The gray mouse that lives in the kitchen wall peeks out of the mouse hole. Cheese, says the gray mouse to herself and scampers off softly off the floor like a gray shadow. But Mrs. Flibberty Jib sees her. Eee, screams Mrs. Flibberty Jib. Squee, squeaks the little gray mouse. See, said Mr. Flibberty Jib, too much noise. Nonsense, says Mrs. Flibberty Jib, and gets off the chair. Well, says Mr. Flibberty Jib, suppose he goes downtown to buy some red yarn for Miss Flibberty Jib's mittens. The first thing he hears is clang, clang, clang. Then, says Miss Flibberty Jib, he walks the curb and gets ready to cross the street. He looks left and right and puts his left foot down, and around the corner comes beep, beep, beep. Then, says Mr. Flibberty Jib, he walks to the curb and gets ready to cross the street again. He looks to the left and right, and around the corner comes clop, clop, cloppity clop. It's no wonder, says Mr. Flibberty Jib, that my head rumbles. Every time, not just once in a time, I go to buy red yarn, then the policeman blows his whistle. Whee! The fire engine races by. Ooh-ah, 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 ooh-ah. When I get home, the front door always slips out of my hand and goes bang. You should eat your roast beef, Mr. Flibberty Jib, says Mrs. Flibberty Jib. And wear your mittens. Nonsense, shouted Mr. Flibberty Jib, giving his umbrella a good hard bump. The noise, it's the noise. Roast beef and mittens, said Mrs. Flibberty Jib. Noise, roared Mr. Flibberty Jib. This went on for days and days. Mr. Flibberty Jib's rumble in his head went on rumbling. At last, Mr. Flibberty Jib came home in a rage. I can't stand this rumble, 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 and bumble, bumble, bumble. We will go to the country where where it's quiet. Everyone knows the country is quiet and a very good place for rumbles and bumbles. Very well, Mr. Flibberty Jib, said Mrs. Flibberty Jib. So Mr. Flibberty Jib packed up his brown shoes and his blue suit and his red tie, and he put on his hat over the rumble in his head, and he was ready to go to the country. Mrs. Flibberty Jib packed up her roasting pans and her knitting needles and her yarn, and she was ready to go to the country. Poor Mr. Flibberty Jib. The train whistle said toot, toot, toot all the way to the country. And every crossing bell said ting, ting, a little ting. But at last, Mr. Flibberty Jib and Mrs. Flibberty Jib got to the country. Mr. Flibberty Jib unpacked his brown shoes and his blue suit and his red tie.